In this study, we propose an LSTM recurrent neural network model that can capture the predictive behavior of hand-eye coordination. This study is a part of my PhD project at Center for Imaging Science at RIT. When we are performing an action that requires precise timing, the coordination between visual information and output motor command is very important. The mechanisms underlying the perceptual control of action are important to our understanding of both the function of perception and also the organization of the action. For example, when we are intercepting with a target that is moving in our field of view, it is shown that we plan our hand movement based on a criteria such as tau. Tau is the ratio of expansion rate over angular size, as you can see in the figure. This determines an estimate of time to contact. This scheme can be categorized as an online control strategy, where our visual system extracts some type of optical variable and it maps it to a motor action. Although these online strategies are beneficial and parsimonious in explaining the information and action loop, but they are not successful in explaining two important features of our oculomotor system. One, prediction, because we need to do prediction since we have motor delay, and second, a performance in the absence of visual information, such as occlusion. Therefore, there is an alternative control strategy that was proposed that takes into account an internal Newtonian physics representation of the target and the subject. Because of relying on an internal model, this scheme of control law can describe the occlusion scenario. And also, these models are more successful in explaining the role of prediction. As you can see here, this model has a mediator called internal model where the physics of the problem is being calculated. Hence, they can be temporarily detached from the visual information and still be valid. Therefore, we would like to answer two major questions in this study. One, what is the role of visual information in action, and can we actually describe a mathematical relationship between the information and action in terms of what type of visual information is sufficient for a specific task, such as target interception? And also, is there a representation minimal for prediction? The reason for that is because we want to be able to explore between these two extreme of spectrums. On one side, we have representation minimal models, where the models are simple and efficient, and they require visual information. And the other far extreme side, on the right side, we have representation heavy models, where they actually rely on physical equations and equations of the Newton's law and the dynamics of the target and subject. We want to know in this spectrum where our control action strategies actually lie. Therefore, we invited 10 subjects and each of them performed 135 VR ball catching trial, while their head and hand movements were being tracked with a 75 Hz motion capture system, as you can see in this video, and also their gaze movement were tracked using a 60 Hz binocular eye tracker. Our system latency was measured to be below 30 milliseconds. The success rate of our subjects were 67% on average, which means this was not an easy task to be performed. This is the experimental monitor view, which is the same as what subjects used to see inside the head-mounted display, except we did not render right and left gaze vectors, as you can see here with orange and yellow color, and also the cyclopean gaze vector, which is the green dot on the screen. So as you can see, the ball launches from a certain distance, it disappears for a fixed 500 milliseconds in time, and then the subject is supposed to move the real paddle, which is represented with a red disc in the virtual world, and intercept with the moving target. To randomize the ball trajectory and also test our hypotheses, we used 3 different pre-blank and 3 different post-blank durations. Remember, the blank duration is the fixed 500 millisecond where the ball was not rendered. So in general, we created 9 different ball trajectories that spans a reasonable range of task difficulty. And as intuitive as it sounds, the more difficult ball trajectory is the one that has the shortest post-blank duration. So now the question is, did the subjects predict? And if they did their prediction actually had an effect on their ocular motor performance? The answer to both of these two questions are yes. So if we take a snapshot of subject's gaze ball angle at the reappearing frame, as you can see in the figure, and present this vertical gaze ball angle on the x-axis, and we also take a snapshot of their hand velocity in the vertical direction 250 milliseconds after the reappearance, so that we allow the information to be processed and leads to a motor command, we can see that there's a linear relationship between how far their gaze were located at the reappearance from the ball, and also how fast they updated their hand velocity in the vertical direction. So it sounds like there is a linear relationship between vertical predictive gaze error and vertical hand velocity. Also, if we divide this analysis for two groups of subjects, on the left figure, you can see the top three successful subjects in terms of how many trials they were successful to catch the ball, and on the right side there are bottom three successful subjects shown in red points compared to the blue points that are successful trials. We can see that not only this linear relationship still holds, but also the more successful subjects used a higher gain to update their hand velocity. Basically, if, for example, they had 2 degrees of visual gaze predictive error, they updated their hand velocity, let's say, for plus or minus 5 meters per second or centimeters per second, compared to the lower or less successful subjects where they updated this with a lower gain. Hence, they had lower rate of catch. Now, what we expect from our modeling scheme is to allow us to capture this information integration period and action generation period, and we want to move this sequence prediction model alongside the ball trajectory and train it on successful human ball catching trials. That's what we want on the left side of this figure is shown. So we use a recurrent neural network model, more specifically long short-term memory cells that are well known to be able to capture time sequences, and it's being widely used in machine translation and text generation applications. So we use one layer of 50 LSTM cells, as you can see here in the middle of the right figure, and we fed in the last m time steps of the 41 input feature vector that I will describe later, and we expect from this model to produce only one time step ahead of time, the action, which is a 16 element feature output. So this is one single model that we are trying to use to actually capture the temporal relationship between input visual information and output action. In our input visual feature, we have all the information available to the human in an egocentric frame of reference. There are some visual and non-visual information listed here. For example, hand, gaze, head, velocity, orientation, position, and their rotation velocity also. Note that the ball information, such as angular position, angular velocity, depth, motion in depth, angular size, expansion rate, and whether it was visible or not as a 0 or 1 flag, is represented again in egocentric frame of reference. For example, ball position is represented in azimuth and elevation, aligned with ecological theory. Note that during the blank period, we put all the values related to ball to 0, so that the model doesn't have any information about the ball position and the ball physics. The first 16 elements of this 41 input feature is the exact same as the 16 elements of the output feature vector, except they belong to the future time step. So this has been shown in this figure with blue and orange colors separately. Now, if we create 34 other copies of the same model that I just described and train them as at every single time step with a new shifted time step ahead of time, then we have kind of a group of model, or if you will, an ensemble of models where they are capable in capturing predictive strategies. Therefore, during training, we use shifted subjects data to train RNN2 and 2 shifted time steps for training RNN3, and this goes on for RNN. In this case, the very first scheme that I presented is captured now. So model knows and sees the integration time, all the M samples during the integration time, and at one time instance, it generates all the future N outputs. To make sure that the model is trained well, as you can see, hand X and hand Z position is shown in these two figures. On the X-axis we have time, and on the Y-axis everything is shown in metric units. Subjects have relatively smooth movement in directions of X and Z. Therefore, the model and hand shown in green circle and blue triangles are well matched. Each line stroke is one ball catching trial. So here we have almost about 17 different ball catching trials all shown together in one single plot. On y-axis, vertical direction of hand movement, we have the model has a harder time to catch up with their very, very abrupt last-minute hand movements, as you can see here. But still, the model is trained well. Same results for gaze elevation and azimuth, comparing model and human data performance, just to make sure that the model is trained well. Now, the main question is, actually, we knew that somehow the model is going to be trained well. This is more of a computational type problem or question. But the more important question is what the model actually learned. What are those visual informations that were taken into account for the model? As I described earlier, the first 16 elements of the input feature vector is going to be the output 16 feature vector. So if we plot on the vertical axis the 41 input feature vector and on the horizontal axis the 50 LSTM cells and show their relative weight with color, here we can see that the brighter those values are, the higher is the weighting. We would expect the model to have higher weights for the first 16 elements because of the temporal extrapolation. But what we can see here is it's not the only thing that the model is doing. The model has actually taken into account ball angular position, ball depth, ball angular size, and also whether it's visible or not, and some other further information into account. To investigate more, we ran an ablation study where at every single iteration we removed one feature vector from the model and then we tested the model. So here in this figure on the right side, the average error covariance matrix is shown. What we would expect, as you can see here, is the diagonal element of this covariance matrix is going to have high error, and by the way, they are normalized vertically because, for example, hand position, when it's removed, is going to have an effect on the future hand position. The more important message of this figure is the off-diagonal elements. For example, if you remove ball angular position, ball depth, angular velocity, and whether it's visible or not, and ablate the model or in some other ways remove this important visual information from the model, almost all of the motor outputs, such as hand position, gaze position, and hand orientation is going to be affected. It's going to have a high error. So this re-emphasizes the fact that the model has actually learned a mapping between input visual information and output action. We are also in the process of developing a temporal visualization code, where it allows us to monitor how does input feature contribution changes in time. So far, what we have found is if we focus on one trial type and record and show the data for all subjects, we can see that the importance of the input visual features is changing in time. More importantly, during the very last portion of this specific trial, where they were actually going to catch the ball, there were only 3 significant visual features of the ball were being used by the model. This actually reminds us the previous studies in a very constrained environment that ball expansion rate, angular velocity, and angular size is somehow determining the time to contact, which means where we would need to initiate or finalize our hand movements. This is an ongoing process. We actually did the same for cell activation patterns. Here we can see that there are 50 LSTM cells, as you can see on the vertical axis, and the same trial type, average over all subjects. What this tells us so far, still, as I said, is under investigation, is each of these 50 LSTM cells has learned something different. For example, some of them are sensitive to the blank duration, some of them are not. That means some of them are doing maybe some type of extrapolation, that's what we guess, but other ones are actually learned or actually trained in a way that they are sensitive to when the ball actually disappeared so that they can convey other temporal information for future time steps. In terms of model accuracy for predicting in time, these two figures can give us an idea. For example, if we show the gaze positioning error of the model and also hand positioning error of the model in time, and time being how much in the future the model was able to predict, we can see that up to something around 300 milliseconds we can consider it as a tolerable low prediction error. And the reason for that is if the model is going to be accurate and catch the ball, we would extend a range around the size of the paddle, which is 7 centimeters, and we end up around 150 to 300 milliseconds. We would need to make sure to find a better metric to present what would be a tolerable range of prediction for this model. If we do the same exact analysis on gaze data, we would end up around 3 to 4, 3 to 5 degrees of visual angle, which is a little bit larger than fovea. As I said earlier, this is still going on, and we need to figure out what would be a good significant metric here. In conclusion, we have presented a group of actually predictive metrics where it tells us the oculomotor performance of the subjects actually depends on how well they were able to predict the movement of the ball in the field of view. And also we presented an LSTM-RNN model which can serve as an existence proof for representation minimal or representation medium, if we can call it, that describes also prediction. And the fact that these models rely only optical variables and proprioceptive signal allows us to say maybe there is no necessity for an internal representation of complicated Newtonian physics in our perception system. And then I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Diaz, and my committee members, Dr. Jeff Pels, Dr. Chris Cannon, Dr. Philip Phillips, and all the lab members at RIT, and you for your attention. Thank you.